Hello, and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I am talking with Dr. Carol Hughes, a leading expert in canine microbiome research, whose episode where we spoke specifically about the microbiome is by far one of your favorites. If you haven't listened to it, I'll leave a link in the show notes and I highly recommend you check it out. But today we're going to be discussing one of Carol's other passions, and that is plant antimicrobials. Carol has been researching plant antimicrobials for over 20 years, and this is a fantastic complement to our discussion of the canine microbiome because plant antimicrobials offer a potential alternative to conventional antibiotics that wreak havoc on the microbiome, and instead, these antimicrobials target specific pathogenic bacteria without disrupting the entire gut system. In this episode, Carol begins by sharing with us her fascinating story of how she first got into this line of research via horses. And you'll be amazed to hear that Queen Elizabeth I is part of this story. We also preface this chat with understanding the context that many of us have lost our knowledge about plants, and now we're actually being asked to reclaim it because we're in an era of antibiotic resistance. Carol dives into how plants actually come to have antimicrobial properties, how they can help us target pathogenic bacteria, and how plant antimicrobials might actually be the microbiome's only hope. She also talks about how you can use plant antimicrobials and which ones you can choose right from your kitchen for your dog's health. And we also talk about how simply walking in the forest and hugging trees might actually be the best medicine. We talk about all of this and so much more. If you listened to my previous conversation with Carol on the microbiome, you'll know that she's an absolute fount of knowledge, so I know you're going to find some real gems in this chat. Before we dive in, just a quick note that this episode is sponsored by Aspirationary, which in full transparency is another project of mine, where we create books, notebooks, and stationery to support you in becoming all you aspire to be. I'm really excited to announce that we have released a Spanish language version of our popular My First Period Tracker for young girls and tweens in order to increase menstrual literacy and empower young people to become advocates for their menstrual health. You can learn more about our books on our Instagram page, which is Aspirationary, spelled Aspirationery. And if you want to learn more about how you can take a more holistic approach to supporting your dog's health, then stay tuned for the outro where I'll share with you some exciting new developments at Mystic Dog Mama. Okay, on that note, let's go. Hi, Carol. Thank you for coming back on the Mystic Dog Mama podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. And I just wanted to say that in our last episode that we did together, focusing on the microbiome, so many people reached out to say how helpful it was, how much they enjoyed it. And they also, it was just really wonderful because I think people feel really lost in this world of canine nutrition and how do they support their dogs. And as we had said before, I mean, there's just so much on the internet that I feel like it can be really overwhelming for people. And so they loved how you contextualized it and gave them some real food for thought, quite literally.
Oh, good,
And so
good.
that was really brilliant. But they
Yeah,
also said to me, because you had mentioned in that episode that part of your company also works with plants looking at antimicrobials. And actually that's
yeah.
where your work started. And they were like, ooh, what is this? What can she come back and talk about it? And so I'm thrilled that you agreed to do just that. So today we're going to focus on the plants.
Yeah, no, great. And thank you for asking. As I said to you earlier, I've been thinking about it all week because it's such an emotional kind of journey for me, or has been. And it's gone on for, I guess, about 20 something years we've been researching. And it's quite a journey, quite a story, really. So yeah, no, it's lovely to be invited. And yeah, do you want me to start at the beginning?
Please start at the beginning.
Well, it started in Newmarket because I started in horse racing. I used to travel the world looking after people's racehorses, and my job um, it's really hard to define, but I just had to keep the racehorse on the track. So whatever method I needed to use, and we talked about healing and a woman's job in the healing role, whatever I could access to keep that horse on the road, I would do it. So I do have a science background, but a big part of keeping the horse on the going was to keep it out of pain and to keep it mentally and physically well through the use of plants. So that's where I started, and I've spent many occasions with some quite important people. I used to work for Vijay Mallya, Sheikh Mohammed, the Queen Mum, taking them on the heath, because the heath at Newmarket is triple SI. So that means it's a site of scientific interest, because nobody's changed the heath at Newmarket for centuries. So all the plants and all the ecosystems that grow there have been there for hundreds of years. So it's a wonderful place to take a horse and an owner or a trainer and just go out and look around the heath and, talk about plants. And we used to do that a lot. So I've had lots of conversations about plants with a lot of people and how they interact with horse health, which was a surprise, really, I think, that we were doing that. So I did discover one of the biggest things with racehorses is they don't, because they're young, these horses were only 2, which I don't think is right. I didn't agree with a lot with horse racing, but the point is, if you're not in it, you can't change it. So my purpose was to get in it and change it for the benefit of the horse, and to take on the vets as much as the trainers and actually confront them and say, no, you can't do that. That's not right. You've got to try and do it differently. And I do remember with the Queen actually having a conversation about how we would train her horse differently, why that would matter. And I think we were talking about some dressage moves at the time, so the dressage moves would make the horse stronger at the core muscle would make it much stronger and take the pressure off its back. And the trainer was actually looking very confused. He was the Queen's trainer. He didn't have a clue what this was about, but the Queen did. And she said, oh, yes, that's okay. I know Princess Anne used to do the same thing because she was an event rider. So from that, a lot of horses, when they're young, they're not strong. So the biggest thing they need is a steroid. And now when I say that, I don't mean an anabolic steroid. I mean a plant-based steroid. So my first job was to develop a steroid from a plant that wouldn't fail a dope test, which sounds awful, but not, or it isn't awful really, because it actually saves the horse from coming out of training. So in the beginning, we had to go to Russia because money was no cost. It didn't matter how much money you spent developing things because there was a lot of money in horse racing. So we went to Russia as part of a discovery kind of, I don't know what you call it. I think it was probably a bit secret, really. It was a bit underground. And we met with some people that had been developing steroids from plants for their athletes. Well, that's fine too, but we didn't want to use it in a dodgy kind of way. I don't know what words to use for it, but we wanted to use it to benefit the racehorse and to support the growth plates and to support the growth of the horse so that he could compete at the level he was supposed to compete at without damaging himself. That was the whole kind of process to do it, rather than be stuffed full of other drugs and other things that trainers could find that might break him down. And that was the whole reason for doing it. So we did find a steroid, and we extracted the steroid. It was an ecdysterone from the plant that we'd chosen. And then the next job was to actually get it into the horse and out of the horse without it failing a dope test. So we had to know what the half-life was and how that would come out in a dope test. It couldn't come out as a steroid. It had to sort of change in the body, become a different metabolite, and then be passed out and not fail a dope test. So that was actually quite stressful for possibly 6 months, trying to get that bit to work. But we did it. We did it, and we used it in Newmarket, and a lot of big backward horses really benefited. So that was my first, I suppose, go at putting a plant into a medicinal kind of format. And then we moved on to anti-inflammatories, and we had to be sure we only had like 2 or 3 days for it to work. So we had to understand how it went through the gut as fast as possible, how it interacted with inflammatory pathways, and how it would benefit the horse so he could just stay in training for a little bit longer as well without failing a dope test. So that was my introduction, really.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting that to, to be honest. That is
No, no, I'm
incredible.
sorry. I'm
No,
sorry about that. I mean, it's such an
no.
emotional.
No, I mean that in a
No.
really positive way. I mean it in a very
Oh,
positive way.
good. Oh,
Yeah,
good.
yeah. No, I mean that's it's an incredible story. And I mean it speaks to I kind of wish in some respects we had just started recording as soon as we started talking because we got into
Yeah. Mm.
this really interesting chat that I'll sum up a little bit around how we have lost in many respects our connection to the plants, how we
Yeah.
had women in particular used to have this connection to the plants and
Yeah.
be able to heal. They were the ones that the village would go to for whatever ailment that they had. And then
Mm.
that we were saying about like this being related to what's often called the witch wound, and where women were punished, quite literally punished for having
Yeah.
that kind of knowledge and separated from it, and then how that has translated down the road into us not wanting to necessarily speak about things, but also not feeling connected to the natural world around us. And I never in a million years would have thought about that relationship between plant steroids and something like
Yeah.
horse racing being an entry
Yeah.
point into thinking about that and re-engaging with that world in a different way. That's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think the thing is with the ecdysteron as well, it's a molting hormone. So it's an insect molting hormone. Insects need ecdysterone to molt, it's part of their process. So we are, and it goes through the brown fat tissue. So it works on the endocrine system. And when you put it in, it just speeds metabolism and supports metabolism. So going on from the racehorse that we had a really good result with, we then went on to obesity because you can use it for obesity. So we used it in horses that have laminitis, and we also then went on to do vet trials and work with butchers' pet care. But in between the horse racing, what we had to do, because the horse racing at that level is so quick in forensics, you had to keep changing the steroid, because with ecdysterones, there must be plants make maybe 400-500 varieties. So you've got a choice, you have a library, and what you have to do is go to the forensic conferences, find out what they're doing, and then make sure you're not doing the same. So you would just choose a different library of steroids, which is really easy to do if you know where to look. And in the meantime, we'd moved to Wales and met with the chemistry department at Bangor University, who were into, I think, what did they call it? Organic chemists, they were. And there was this sudden move to investigate plants and turn them into medicine. So for us, that was a marriage made in heaven, because it meant we had access to, because we were a business, so they wanted to work with businesses. Mm-hmm. I think the funding only worked if they worked with a business, and you could have access to their labs, you could get students, and that set us off on a whole different pathway of making steroids at that time, and then moving on to anti-inflammatories, moving on to obesity in dogs and people and horses. And yeah, and then it moved into the sustainable economy. So the idea was that I didn't have to go to China at that time. We'd done Russia and we moved to China, but China has an amazing infrastructure of making chemicals from plants. I mean, they just do it so well. But the point was, we wanted to do it from the UK, so you could extract a plant compound from a UK plant that wouldn't be used for food. So that's the sustainability. So at the time we were looking at ferns, so bracken. In Wales we have lots of bracken, lots of ivy, and at the time it was wild spinach, so wild plants that aren't being used for anything else. And the idea was that we would extract the steroid, the ecdysteron, from those plants, and that wouldn't rob the economy of a food item. So that's what we were working on. which was amazing. And we used to meet up at Kew Gardens, so we had access to Kew, everything at Kew, which was just a plant. I mean, it was just a wonderful time, but it didn't really evolve. I'm still buying the steroid from China, so it didn't really move into the mainstream, which was a shame, really. It just kind of went round in circles for a while. And then the drug companies got involved and synthesized all these plant compounds anyway. So there was never any desire to make a plant a medicine. They just wanted to get the compounds, rob the compounds, and make them into synthetic medicine. So that was a bit of a shame, really. But we worked with some people that grew daffodils, and they discovered if they grew them up a mountain, because they don't really like growing up mountains, if you grow daffodils right at the top of the mountain, they'll make more of a compound. And they were trying to treat Alzheimer's with it.
Wow.
Yeah, but I think we started working with them 15 years ago, and they still haven't found a manufacturer that will take that plant compound on. They've only found synthetic people that will do it synthetically.
That's such a shame. And again, we were talking before we started about that sort of disconnection that's happened for us between when we have an understanding and we have a connection and a relationship with the plant, and then
Yeah,
greed enters the picture
yeah,
and industry
yeah,
wants to synthesize it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I think that was the great shame of it, really. And the way they still want to disconnect you from that plant. I think if you look at salicylic acid, if you look at aspirin, that's one plant compound, and there may be 50, 60 in willow, and they've just taken one, synthesized it, and made it aspirin, and now they're revisiting it because there must be probably 150 other compounds that they can look at from all the different varieties of willow that will be a medicine. Well, why not just allow people to give people that knowledge and just say, why don't you use medicine? Why don't you just use willow as a medicine instead? It's been banned certainly for use in horses.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we'll see. I mean, we were talking about tides turning, and I think that it's really interesting where in the kind of communities that I'm in, and I sort of pay attention to what's going on as an indicator of potentials, that there is a real groundswell of people really wanting to reclaim this knowledge that in many respects we haven't recognized that we have a right to. It's
yeah,
and that we think that only certain people are allowed to have access to this knowledge. But I think that the more we see the systems that we've put our faith and trust in not necessarily delivering and starting to collapse, and
mm,
we have to look elsewhere, that we will start to become our own advocates, or we will work together to become our own advocates for accessing knowledge about the world around us, about our own
yeah,
bodies, about the plants in our own gardens. We will create this groundswell of people really wanting to access that again, and to not just to access it, but I think there's an important component that's often missing from this discussion about coming into relationship with it, so
yeah,
that it's not so much about repeating the allopathic perspective, the allopathic
yeah,
approach to plants or anything else of what can this fix, but actually developing a relationship with
yeah,
the plant to
yeah,
understand it and see it as having its own
yeah,
agency and
yeah,
playing a bigger role, and not us in a dominant sort of extractive relationship.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's lacking, but I think we're quite a long way from that at the moment. I mean, certainly, I suppose I can look at animals. Yeah. Do you think we are a long way from that? Um,
I don't know. Yes and no. Yes and no. I feel as though things are kind of quickening in a
yeah,
positive way. I think we're seeing changes starting now that I would have said I wouldn't see in my lifetime necessarily.
yeah,
So I'm hopeful, and maybe that's a naivete, but I do think that more and more people are looking at, even things like using YouTube, using these sort of open platforms where to change the way that we're educating ourselves, that
Yeah,
like going to the university and getting a degree, particularly in a place like America, where the cost of doing so is so prohibitive to so many
yeah,
people, that
yeah,
people are looking at, well, do we have to actually follow these guidelines, these systems that were put in place of this is what you're meant to do? How can I educate myself in other ways? And going to these alternative practices. And so because that kind of a will and that kind of a mentality is growing,
yeah,
that gives me hope that perhaps that can extend to other ways of being in
yeah,
relation.
yeah. You're right. Because we use a plant that's grown as a primary healthcare crop in Brazil. So it's called May Tennessee ilicifolia. Um, and they grow it as a medicine. So they stress it, they have particular conditions to grow it in, but it is a medicine and they see it as a medicine. So I guess if we could only just take that step,
Mm-hmm.
it would be a good step. But it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like we have to say, well, it can't be called a medicine. It's a plant. You can't call it that, but we can rob the compounds and put patents on it and make it into something else that we will then sell back to you, but we're in control of it, which is a bit of a shame. But they did have something called the Nagoya. It was I don't know what you call it. It was when we go into countries like the rainforest, South America, and discover plants. There was a kind of bunch of scientists that were doing that and taking the plants, bringing them back out. The Nagoya concept was it? But they were bringing the plants out, and then they were exploring, asking native tribes people what they use them for, and then robbing them of that knowledge. So, and making a patent against that knowledge, and they're making money out of it. And so I think that they stopped them doing it. But I did Google it the other day because it was such a good thing, but I don't see it. It's a little bit like these initiatives. They last as long as there's money to do it, and then they die a death, really. But I think that's interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
We're still, wherever there's sort of gold, it's whatever the next gold rush is. And I think for a while it was plants. People just rush in and grab something for themselves, don't they?
Yeah, they do. They do. But I'm hopeful that will shift. But I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm curious what you're doing with plants now, and specifically what you're doing with antimicrobials.
Well, I think we are in a state, aren't we? I mean, to me, I always look at it as a crisis. I try not to look at it as a crisis, but almost the information is telling me it's a crisis, going back to the microbiome. And also, well, other diseases, really.
Mm.
So there's been a lot of research on how plants have an antimicrobial action, and they have that action because plants can't run. So if they're in a field and they're attacked by a parasite, a bacteria, a virus, or even a horse trying to eat it, they have to defend themselves or die, or they're gone. So the plant will, obviously, the more stressed it is and the better it is stressed, really, will just keep producing lots of different chemicals until it can survive. And most of those chemicals are against bacteria because they live in the soil and the soil has plenty of bacteria. So they're always making novel antibiotics, but the gut bacteria make novel antibiotics as well. But the trouble is, we keep trying to wipe them out. We're at war with them, aren't we? So we're wiping out the bacteria that make bacteria compounds. So we've got to try and get them from another source. And plants are a fantastic source of antimicrobials, but it's just how you. It's almost not knowing that that's what the plant does. It's how you explain that to someone and how they can then use it as an antimicrobial, because it's a very difficult thing for someone to get their head around, I think. Do you think? Is that?
I think in this community, it's becoming, I think it's more understood, but I agree. I think mainstream, we've talked before about our culture having a very anti kind of perspective when it comes to anything
Yeah,
microbial and seeing all of that as bad and not necessarily understanding that everything plays a part in the ecosystem. It's that sense of needing to think of everything as an ecosystem. And I think you
Yeah,
did a beautiful job in the microbiome episode, which if you've not listened to, listeners, I will link that so you can go back and listen to it. But where you talked about it being like the Great Barrier Reef or like a garden, and that things are constantly adapting and changing to support the overall health
yeah,
of that
yeah,
ecosystem. And I think we've lost
yeah,
sight of that. So again, that
yeah,
that allopathic approach of like, oh, I've got this symptom, I need to get rid of it, instead of, and then I'm not saying that we don't want to, like, obviously, when there's a health problem or pain or anything like that, we want to address it. But I think that
yeah,
we do it in a limited way without understanding that whatever we're going to do to treat that is going to have an impact on the wider ecosystem. And
yeah,
how do we consider that? And especially in the case of antibiotic use, and primarily antibiotic overuse and misuse, which has
yeah,
then led to the crisis that we're in of antibiotic resistance. So we've just
yeah,
pumped this into ourselves, our animals, etc., and created really a toxic environment where
yeah,
the drugs are no longer working
yeah.
like they used to.
No, no. And it's just such a hard one, isn't it? Because you to start reversing it, I mean, certainly with the microbiome, the only hope for the microbiome is if you use plant antimicrobials, because it's not reacting, if it's not making its own antibiotics, and it's resistant to the antibiotics we put in. How can you change? How can you get rid of the bacteria that are resistant to antimicrobials unless you put in an antimicrobial that it's never seen before, and it acts against it, so it can get rid of the resistant bacteria by killing them off. But that's a big kind of thing to get your head around, isn't it? It's a big step to try and understand that that's what a plant will do. um, I know it will do it, and I'm quite happy with that. But it's how you get that over to someone. And I know I was talking to Caroline Griffiths the other day, and she was saying, "Well, you just say, well, the microbe, you need to give a little bit of this plant or a little bit of that plant, and it seems to work." But it works because the bacteria in the gut, you know what they are, and you know they won't. They're resistant to ordinary antibiotics. So you've just got to kill them off with a new one, and that's okay because there's lots of research on plants as antimicrobials because researchers are trying to replace antibiotics. I mean, in the 20 years, the sad thing is, again, in the 20 years that I've been researching plants as antimicrobials, not one, or maybe one out of thousands and thousands and thousands of screened compounds have actually made it into being an antibiotic. So it shows you the drivers for making that work aren't really there, but I don't know why they're not there. They'll do the research, but they can't actually, you won't see a plant antimicrobial on the market. So I wonder
Right.
why. I don't
Well,
know.
yeah, I'm curious as to whether or not, I mean, my guess is going to be a money thing, whether they don't see enough
Yeah,
profit from it or what have you. But I'm wondering if that can actually be a benefit to those of us who don't necessarily want to use and abuse the plants in that kind of way, but
yeah,
we can access them. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how one might start thinking about working with antimicrobials, with
yeah,
plants for their antimicrobial properties for themselves and for their dogs. What might that look like?
yeah. I think with dogs, because with horses it's ever so easy. They eat plants, so that's the end of it.
Mm,
So as long as you give them enough choice of plants, they kind of help themselves and work it out, don't they? And a lot of my journey has been about restoring our own 25 acres to have plants that help horses, but also the dogs get involved too. We've also got dogs, so they do get involved in certain ways, but they're more likely to go for the volatile organic compounds. So they'll breathe
mm,
compounds in, they'll breathe in antimicrobials. But for that, you have to have a mixed forest to have on your land. And we've got one. So I don't know, we didn't mean to have one, but we just happened to buy a land with an old forest on it. So we know we can measure what volatile organic compounds. We did a big research project on that, and the dogs will breathe it in, and you will breathe it in. So if you walk in the forest on an autumn day, the leaves will kick out volatile organic compounds. If you've got cancer and you've got the old trees, you have to have a deciduous mix. Old trees, old oaks, we've got old oaks, not the new varieties of trees don't do it, but the old varieties will sense that you are ill and will make more volatile organic compounds for you. We work with a truly wonderful scientist. I mean, I don't think this is almost not science to me, because these people are so brilliant at what they do, but they have ways of measuring which trees, and old apple trees are the best. So if you've got an old apple orchard, like a russet apple, his speciality was actually old species of apple trees. They will kick out this kind of volatile organic compound and a type of pheromone. So when we used to hear of people or talking to trees or hugging trees, I don't know if you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
That actually is fact. They've proved it with science, but you wouldn't hear it, would you?
No.
Since when have you ever been told to go for a walk in the wood and that will help? I don't know. Would you even know that would help?
No, not in that sense, other than, I mean, now we might talk about like forest bathing for mental health, that,
Yeah.
and how we're seeing more and more the impact of being separated from green spaces, what that's doing to people's mental health. But
Oh, massive.
I mean, no, I never would have thought that the tree, I mean, yes and no. I'm not surprised, and yet I am surprised. It's just so miraculous, and kind of like, well, of course, because this we're an ecosystem again.
Yeah.
We're supporting one another, we're feeding into one another. But that is just absolutely incredible that they can sense what it is that we need. And I'm curious, is that only if you have an established relationship, if they're sensing that same person over
Do
and
you know,
over?
I wish I knew more about it. I know we did that initial work with him, and it was so astounding to me. But then we kind of moved on, because we can only do what we're kind of funded to do. And I kind of lost track of him, and we moved on to other things. But I often go around because I walk around the woods every day and take the dogs, and I kind of almost, I'm humbled really that these trees are doing something for me, and I don't even know. I don't go and say, wow, I felt better because I breathed in the trees or I breathed in the leaves, although I know everyone enjoys it, but there isn't really a way of measuring it, is there? Do you know what I
Right.
mean? There isn't. I don't have a little meter that says volatile organic compounds this high, so sometimes I don't really appreciate it. But
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. And it just adds yet another layer for why I think it's important that we get out in nature and that we establish a relationship with it for ourselves and for our dogs as well. Like you said, taking them out.
yeah, I mean, I think this because we have the land. I mean, really, we didn't mean to buy the land, and it was very overgrown, but we fell in love with it, and because I came from Newmarket, which was sort of manicured paddocks and not another plant in sight, really, apart from on the heath. So coming to Wales with its seed banks and its forests, and the ability to restore the pasture, it's taught me a lot. And you are complete. I can say that 110%. If you've got your horses, dogs, and you live close to that land, you are complete for sure.
You're living the dream, Carol, I tell you.
Yeah, well, it's hard work. I mean,
Yeah.
it is often really hard work, but yeah, no, it's worth it.
Yeah.
But I think you look after it, and it seems to look after you. Is that the way to say it?
Yeah. 100%. 100%. And I think that's the same with our dogs too, with that kind of relationship we have with them. But for
Yeah, but going back to dogs, so with dogs and plants, they take me. I think we go out, we walk. I know the plants are there. I know what they'll seek out to eat. Um, Mostly it's couch grass. So it's that stuff in the garden that no gardener likes, and they seem to dig that up and eat that. But they will eat herbs. I think dogs are quite big on herbs. We have a herb garden, and we cut them down twice a year because it increases the chemicals. So the antimicrobials in the herbs, as long as you harvest them, cut them down a couple of times a year. They're much higher in antimicrobials if you do that. And I think, I don't know, with dogs, they seem to like soil more than plants, really, if you're letting them choose, or they like other animals' poo.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they definitely
But
do.
I think there's probably a lot of antimicrobials in that as well. They just sort of recycled, aren't they?
Right, right. So if people are, I guess I've got a couple of questions that are off the back of that. How might we consider using antimicrobials for our dogs in a either preventative capacity or to help support when something comes up health-wise with the dogs? And
Yeah,
thinking about like people who don't necessarily have access to the land or to those like what can we use that's perhaps in our kitchens, for example, or how can people
yeah.
support their dogs?
I think you won't go wrong with oregano, thyme, and rosemary. They're really
Mm,
strong antimicrobials, but you're better off growing them yourself if you can, and cutting them down, because it does increase the antimicrobial compounds. That's really good. The dogs seem to like those too. Um, I think they like thyme, don't they, more than, because it's a
mm,
little bit sweeter. Um, we use Maintenance ilicifolia, which is a Brazilian, I think it's called is it Holy Basil or
mm-hmm,
Espinira Santa? You can buy tea bags. I think you can get it easier in America than you can here, because people know it quite well.
mm-hmm.
That's a really good product for dogs because it's very gentle on the gut, and it's also anti-inflammatory, and it's an analgesic. So you get a sort of a whammy with that. I really like white willow, but a lot of it's got a kind of bad rep. But what I do is boil the leaves up in a bit of water and make a tea for the dogs, and they seem to think that's pretty okay. So I think you can go out and forage in the hedgerows quite well, can't you?
Yeah.
Depending on where you live.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so when you're giving the dogs the herbs, are you doing that in a fresh form or are you drying them?
I do lots of different ways. My favorite is to do it in bone broth and just allow the herbs to lose their polyphenol content by boiling up the broth and then letting the herbs kind of seep in it and let them lose all the good chemicals into the broth. I think that's a really good way of doing it. Yeah.
Mm. And I never want to recommend to people that we replace pharmaceuticals. Like if your dog is on pharmaceuticals, these are conversations you need to have with your vets. But
Yeah.
but I do think it's helpful to have the conversation around what can we do to support our dogs to either limit overexposure to things like antibiotics or to help support when antibiotics haven't been working, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think one course of antibiotics depends really. Different dogs, if they have a good diversity in the microbiome, they can cope with a course, one or two courses of antibiotics, and it just seems to come back, and that's fine. But if you've got some dogs, I don't know what makes some dogs have less
Mm,
microbes, but those are the dog ones that don't really come back, and they seem to then have a gut full of antibiotic resistant bacteria. So I think being more accurate how you find the what's going on in the gut is probably better. If you can find out how the dog is reacting to the antibiotic, you've got a better chance of putting it back together, haven't you? So we've got
mhm.
lots of different ways. Berberine is another plant I really like, because it seems to be multitasking. We always go for plants that do lots of jobs but are very gentle on the system, because I think with dogs they're so sensitive, aren't they? More so than horses. I don't know why that is, but they seem to respond really keenly to any change. Anything you put in, they'll respond to, um,
Yeah.
which can be good and can be not so good at the same time.
Absolutely. I've definitely found that with my dog as well. And I think something, I talk about this fairly regularly on the podcast, but something that I think is a useful way of introducing new things is through self-selection. So if I
Yeah,
sense that Lucky's got a little bit of tummy upset, in fact, this morning he had a little bit of tummy upset. And so I'm just kind of watching him now and I offer him a variety of different herbs or
yeah,
different items for him to kind of see what he needs, because they are much more in tune with themselves than we
Yeah.
are in that way.
With my horses, I think you're absolutely right. And with the dogs, their gut brain axis is very strong, and so and the same with the endocrine system. But with the horses, if we have a horse from Newmarket which hasn't had access to any plants, and we put it out with our herd, the leader of the herd will show the new horse what to eat.
Oh,
So
God, I
that's
love.
great, isn't it? But
Oh.
I think that dogs need probably the same. So actually offering dogs the chance to be able to select is really good.
Mm. And would you suggest doing that sort of regularly rather than just
Yeah,
in response to an illness? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I would. I don't there aren't many occasions I go to a vet. I'd rather keep them well, but understand the ecology. If you can understand the ecology and the environment you're in and work on that, you've got a much better chance of not really going to the vet, haven't
Mm.
you? And we are lucky. I do get that. We are lucky. I don't know if we were in a city, you'd probably have to go to the seaside a lot, because dogs by the seaside are always healthier.
Mm.
From our microbiome testing, they seem to be much better off by the sea.
Hmm. Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. And I think we are too, to be honest, when we're out
Yeah.
there with them and we've got our feet on the sand. And yeah, no, I would agree with you that. I'm kind of curious too how your research into the plants is connecting to or informing your work with the microbiome specifically, and then how that's related to your FMT work as well.
Well, it didn't start off thinking that we would need plant antimicrobials when we were looking at the microbiome, although we did do work on manipulating the microbiome of sheep and ruminants
Mm.
using plants. So it was sort of in the background. Um, I think with ruminants, there was that odd period where they were really into methane emissions. You remember
Mhm.
that kind of period? So cows making methane were, you had to really work to stop them making methane, which I think they've moved on from now, because who knows, it's all a bit bewildering. But ivy, we worked with ivy. So ivy berries have a saponin that reduces methane emissions in cattle, so we worked with that for a while. And I think when we started doing the microbiome, we didn't think we would have to look to plants to act as antimicrobials. I think we thought more of probiotics or gut pain or inflammation or things like that. And when we very first started, it was really the gut had infections, so they had overgrowths of pathogenic bacteria. So again, we weren't really looking at plants to do that. But suddenly, with this antibiotic resistance, it's coming in the last maybe 4 years. You have to look to the plant because there isn't anything else that you can look to that will do the job.
Mm. Do you?
And it's funny, it's a funny one really, because I'm listening to I suppose I like to look to what's happening in the future, and there's this thing about not eating meat, and that meat is kind of bad for people. I'm not sure what they say about dogs so much, because I don't think they've attacked dogs in the same way. But if you don't feed your dog meat, then the bacteroidetes that digest carbs and kibble, they just increase. So they are the inflammatory bacteria. They're the ones that are, and if you give antibiotics, bacteroidetes are the ones that remain in the gut, not all the other ones get wiped out. So immediately you're predisposing it to be set up to be antibiotic resistant. But if you feed meat, you reduce the bacteroidetes. But I think the move towards vegetarianism means that you are going to lose the bacteria that aren't antibiotic resistant, which is a bit of a shame, really, because you're going to be left with a different problem.
Hmm. Oh, thank you for sharing that. This is where I just need to just have you talk, because little bits of things just come out all the time whenever I engage with you. You're just so brilliant. I thank you for raising this, because I think there is a real movement in the dog world towards conflating ideas of sustainability and how do we stop feeding our dogs meat. And I think one of the
Yeah,
things, I mean, this goes back to what we were saying what we've said all along about considering things from an ecosystem perspective. I'm of the argument that we have to look at dogs are facultative carnivores. They play a
Yeah,
role in the ecosystem. All
yeah,
carnivores play a role in the ecosystem. And we saw this in Yellowstone, for example, when the wolves
yeah,
were removed, what happened there? It just went nuts. You reintroduce the wolves and everything comes back into balance. And I think
yeah,
we've sort of lost sight and we've not necessarily done the other maths as well around what actually happens when we're growing. When you look at like what's in most vegan dog foods, for example, it's a lot of soy-based proteins that are used
yeah.
as the protein source. There are massive implications, even just from a kind of agricultural perspective and sustainability perspective of growing
Yeah,
all those fields of soybeans. So it's like you said, we're trying to attack a problem in one particular way, but not necessarily really understanding the ripple effect of those
yeah.
problems and that we're going to create other problems by doing that. And I think our dogs, unfortunately, are paying the price for,
More so than any other animal. I think the only other animal I think is as bad is the macaw. Because I think it lives in a cage and it has a very rapid metabolism, and they're not feeding the bacteria that relate to that metabolism. And because it can't fly and do what it needs to do, it's equally bad, really.
mm,
So that they get quite a lot of illness, I think, don't they? As
yeah.
far as I know from working on them. And elephants are a bit the same.
It's the whole captivity thing, isn't it? When we stop an animal from being able to do what it naturally evolved to do.
But then also, I don't know why we can't see an ecosystem. I don't know why we can't just see, okay, all right, that's a dog, but he's also an ecosystem and we're part of that. We're all part of something that works together. And I think we've just forgotten to respect that, haven't we?
Yeah.
I'm as guilty as anyone. I don't walk around my wood and say thank you for putting out volatile organic compounds when I might not feel very well, because I can't see it, but I can learn about it, and then I can be in awe of it, which I am. I mean, I'm in awe of the guy who taught me that. I'm in awe of going to Kew Gardens and learning, what they've taught for so many centuries, haven't they, at Kew
Mhm.
Gardens? So I think we do have this wonderful base of people, don't we, if we can just access them and listen to what they've got to say.
Definitely. And that's where I'm a huge advocate as well for. Like I do animal communication. And I think that my perspective on it has massively expanded from when I first learned to do it. Because what it's
Yeah,
really shown me is one, I mean, everybody can do this. We are all doing it all the time. We're just not
yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
aware of it. But when you become
yeah,
aware of it and you actually harness it, less from like, oh, I just want to know what my dog's thinking, or the kind of like, oh, this is so cool kind of factor, but you
yeah,
recognize that it's an inbuilt way for us to recognize our connection to everything around us. So it's not just animal
yeah,
communication, it is nature communication. Like we are
yeah,
constantly in conversation. And I actually feel like that's part of a key of helping people to recognize the role that they are playing in all of this.
yeah,
And when we feel connected, this was something
yeah,
that came out of my PhD research on climate
yeah,
change,
yeah,
where I was looking at climate change as an example of wicked problems. And what we're talking about today,
yeah,
antibiotic resistance, everything, those are wicked problems where you try to find a solution in one area, and no matter what
yeah,
you do, you're going to create a ripple effect of other changes.
yeah,
And so, how do you weigh that up and how do you think about it? But in my research, I was using climate change as the example, and how do we connect people to it so that they
yeah,
feel part of
yeah.
the
No, you've
solution,
got it.
right?
Yeah, you've got it. That's absolutely where we're at, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
And I think things like
Sure.
going out into the woods and having, whether you see it as a spiritual practice or just a kind of recognition, an intellectual recognition, or whatever works for
Yeah,
you, to see that you are actually connected to all of this, the more we personalize that, the more we
yeah,
see that we are intricately involved in this. And again, going back to what we were saying prior to recording, other systems are not going to come in and save us. We need to
No.
save ourselves by
Yeah.
seeing ourselves as part of all of this and recognizing that you are connected. And as because you are connected, you have agency. And you can
Yeah.
advocate for that agency. And whether you find that through animal communication, whether you find that through regenerative farming and getting engaged with that, whether it's through exploring the microbiome, doesn't matter. It's an entry point
No.
for you to see that you're
Yeah.
part of this whole thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Now, going back to horse racing, how it was very hard. It was a very hard thing to be in because care for the horses can be less, let's say, than it should be. But there were some amazing people in that industry, and I was always grateful for them that did get it. They got the fact that they could go on the heath and look at plants, and they wanted to know about the plant, and they wanted to know about how to make their horses better through the plants. And we've been many times and kind of dug up grass and planted herbs, and so they've done their little bits for that horse in that situation. And I think that's so to be highly commended. I've been around the desert with Bedouins and learnt about plants that they know and understand. And it's such a language for everyone to talk, isn't it? You know, it's such a wonderful language, and we shouldn't have it stolen away from us. We shouldn't be separated from it. And I think we were in the 90s when that law came out that you could no longer say a plant was beneficial, and that kind of, I would say, probably cut us off, didn't it?
Yeah, I actually think that was sort of the death knell. I think it had been
Yeah, I think
going
it
on,
was.
prior. And I think it's, going back to what we were saying about the witch wound, I think it actually started hundreds of years ago that
Yeah,
that sort of separation started. But I
yeah.
do think that the legislation was sort of the death knell for us feeling connected.
But
But
I know we've challenged it
yeah.
because we have, I don't know if you know the legislation where you have the veterinary medical directorate that will come after you. You have to have a member of the public, which is usually a company that's in competition with you, and they tell the veterinary medical directorate that you're saying something about a product that isn't the right language to talk, and then they come after you. Um, and we have that a lot, but I do change it if I need to change it. But I go to my MP and I say, you need to take them to task because they're out of hand. And I know my MP, and she had a really good secretary. They looked into it, and there was something like 136 pages to this document that they'd put through in the 90s. And literally, it was passed overnight when no one was in the house, no one was there, no one was bothering. And it went through, and then suddenly it was law. But it isn't law. It actually isn't law. It's just that you have to stand up for your rights and defend what it is you want to say. And then they will back off, but you have to know that to start with.
Absolutely.
Because we've actually taken it to the European Court of whatever it is, and they've said no. You can feed an animal whatever plant you want. It can't be a plant. Although we have these lists of plants you're only allowed to feed animals. If an animal wants to eat a plant, it can eat any plant. And you kind of think, well, it took, I mean, how bizarre, how foolish is that, really?
I know, but like we were saying earlier, I do think this is a time of reclamation and a time of recognizing our own agency and becoming
But
advocates.
yeah, and I think it is going to take that change in mind,
Mhm.
because if you go into the industry is so fearful. The mainstream part of the pet industry, they're so fearful of what they can say or can't say, um, and it's so kind of structured, isn't it?
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
think it's going to take a different move, really.
It will take a different move, but I think it starts with pet parents like the listeners to podcasts like this one that are
Yeah,
interested in this and want to start taking action for themselves and for their dogs and looking at like what's in my kitchen garden that I can be feeding my dog and
yeah.
how do
But it
I
saddens me. It saddens me with grass, and when dogs eat grass, to me, that's a good thing because I know what's in it and what it's likely to benefit the dog and what bacteria it's going to change. And it saddens me that someone will have an advert and say, well, if your dog's eating grass, you need to give this. And you think, but that's just so blind, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. We assume that it means that the dog is sick when in reality they're self-medicating. They know what it
Yeah,
is that they need. But
yeah,
to your point, I think that this is all part of a shift in consciousness, a shift in
yeah,
the way that we're thinking about health, a shift in the way that we think about our relationship to the environment, a shift in the
yeah,
way that we think about medicine and what that's actually
yeah,
about. And it will take time, but I think it's happening. I do think it's
yeah,
happening.
yeah. I think with the dog, I'll feel happier when we go back to where we were in 2018. I think when I see that come back, if I see it come back, that'll make me very happy because it means we've saved the ecosystem.
Mm.
But if it goes on, I don't know where it's going to. I suppose that's the,
Do you mean from
that's the,
do you mean from a microbiome perspective with the
yeah,
trends that you
yeah,
saw from 2018? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
They are, I mean, I think you said this in the last episode. Dogs really are a bit of the canary in the coal mine for us, aren't they, about what's going
yeah,
on? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, they are. They are. It's yes, who knows? Watch this space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Carol, is there anything I've not asked you that you feel is important for listeners to hear?
Um, I don't know. Is there anything? It's such a big story, isn't it? Plants and antimicrobials and the microbiome. It's such a massive area. Um, no, I don't know. I think I should write a book, maybe,
I think you should.
and I don't know, just how to choose your plant antimicrobials would be. I do it for the horses. I've actually written one for the horses, but I don't think it's going to be published for another year. Um, but to do the same with dogs would be great.
Yeah. So if you had a couple of top tips for listeners about how they can go about choosing antimicrobials for their dogs, where should they
I
start?
definitely I definitely stick with the oregano,
Okay.
rosemary, and thyme. We recommend those in everything we do. I think that the Matina salicifolia, if you can get that in tea bags, that's fantastic for the microbiome because it's gentle. Because you need things that are gentle and are going to get rid of, going to kill off the microbes slowly. You don't want to have a big shedding event and it all go wrong. So definitely those 3, 4 herbs I'd start with, and also couch grass, whatever you call it in your country. I don't know, it's got loads of different names, so I'm not really sure what it is. Bark is good. I do love willow bark, but you have to use it carefully because it can be quite strong. It's a very strong antimicrobial. So use it with care. But
Okay.
yeah, start with those.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for just everything. I love
No.
having these chats with you. And like you said, they're complex and they are huge topics. So I envision we could have many different conversations about this because they're
Yeah.
important conversations to be having.
Yeah, no, they so are. And I think the final thing I'd say to people is trust the plant. It makes so many different chemicals. There's always something new in a plant that you can use. So trust them.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Carol.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for my conversation with Dr. Carol Hughes. Isn't she incredible? If you'd like to reach out to Carol or you'd like to learn more about her work and how to order a microbiome test and report for your dog, visit her website biomeforpets.com. And that's biome, the number 4, pets.com. I've left the link in the show notes. And if a holistic approach to caring for your dog resonates with you and you're interested in learning more about how you can put the puzzle pieces together, Stacy Renfrey of Hozo Hounds and I are teaming up to launch our Fetch membership, which is designed to teach you the same holistic framework that we use in our canine nutrition and well-being practices, so that you too can confidently take control of your dog's health journey. Comment, fetch, or DM me on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, or send me a message on my website, mysticdogmama.com, for more information. Finally, if you're enjoying the podcast, I would be so grateful if you would consider liking, following, subscribing, and leaving a comment or review. Not only does it mean the world to me to connect with you and hear what you're enjoying, it also helps the algorithm to put the podcast in front of more people so that we can continue helping other pet parents who are looking for some support and growing this beautiful community. Okay, until next time.